3 weeks after my wife passed away in an unexpected accident. A mysterious person claiming to be my wife's private lawyer gave me a mysterious key and a letter and said, "Your wife instructed me to give these things to you if she is no longer around." I did not understand. I started to follow and found the house. When I opened the door, I was stunned when I saw the person waiting for me inside. "Grateful you're here, that means everything. Quick ask, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. Your country, your city. Let's see how far this story travels." One note before we start: parts of this story are fictional, added for depth and entertainment. Names and locations are coincidental, but the lesson it carries is entirely yours to keep. I was standing at the kitchen counter watching the coffee maker work its slow, unhurried way through the morning when my phone rang. The number was a 704 area code I didn't recognize, not stored in my contacts, not a number I'd seen before. For a half second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. I almost did. I had spent 37 years as a structural engineer, and somewhere in those years, I had developed what my colleagues called a resting steadiness, a capacity to stay functional when circumstances required it. I had stood on exposed scaffolding in 20-mile-an-hour winds. I had told clients their projects needed to be torn down and rebuilt from the foundation. I had learned to hold difficult information at a careful distance, just long enough to process it without going under. So when the voice on the line identified itself as Sergeant Dale Morrison of the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, I squared my shoulders and told myself to listen carefully. There had been a serious accident on Interstate 85 northbound near exit 33. A vehicle registered to a Catherine Weller. He needed me to come to the scene. He said he was sorry. I poured my coffee into the sink. A reflex, some motion my hands needed, while the rest of me caught up with what my ears had already understood. Then I took my keys from the hook by the door and walked out into the April morning. The drive took 11 minutes. I counted the traffic lights: 4 red, 2 green, 1 yellow. I drifted through without fully registering. When I arrived, the northbound lanes were partially blocked. 3 patrol cars sat with their lights rotating in the pale, clear sky. A fire truck was parked at an angle across the shoulder. An ambulance was on the scene, but it was not moving with any urgency. I gave myself 3 seconds before I looked directly at the vehicles. 3 seconds felt like the right amount. An officer met me at the barricade and walked me through the procedure with the careful courtesy of someone who had done this many times before. A series of questions, a form attached to a clipboard, a visual confirmation conducted behind a curtain that had been drawn with the particular diplomacy of people trained to make the unbearable slightly less so. A signature at the bottom of a document I did not read in full. I confirmed it was Catherine. I signed my name where I was directed. Sergeant Morrison shook my hand and told me again that he was sorry. I thanked him for his professionalism, because that is the kind of man I have always been, and because I had no other words that were available to me just then. I drove home the same route I had come. Our house on Selwyn was a red brick colonial built in 1948. For 31 years, Catherine had been quietly shaping it into something that carried her in every corner. Bookshelves along walls I had originally meant to leave empty, a reading nook carved out of the guest closet that she treated as personal territory, throw pillows in shades of rust and deep blue that I had resisted for years before I stopped noticing them entirely. After enough time, the things a person loves become indistinguishable from the structure around you. You stop seeing them and simply know they are there. Walking through the front door at 9:45 in the morning, I understood for the first time how much noise a house can make when there is no one else inside it. Her coffee mug was on the counter, the wide ceramic one with the chip along the handle that she had refused to replace for 3 years. The coffee in it had gone cold. On the living room sofa, Her reading glasses lay folded on top of a library novel she had checked out 2 weeks ago. I picked up the book without thinking about it. She had stopped at page 247 and turned down the corner of the page to hold her place. She had done that with every book she had ever read. For 34 years of marriage, it had driven me quietly, affectionately out of my mind. I set the book back down in the exact position I had found it. I sat in the armchair by the window and did not turn on any lights. The afternoon came and went without my noticing it much. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barked in its usual way. A delivery van moved through the neighborhood at its ordinary Tuesday pace. The world outside this house was operating exactly as it always had, and I found I was not yet angry about that. I was not yet anything in particular. I did not call anyone. In the first few hours, I told myself I was still processing. Later, the more honest reason presented itself. I did not know where to begin. 34 years of marriage. Catherine had touched every part of my life so completely that the task of cataloging her absence person by person, phone call by phone call, until every soul who had known her had been told, felt like something with no visible end. I was not ready to start it. The doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Ethan was standing on the porch, with his jacket still on keys, still in his hand, like a man who had not paused between hearing the news and moving toward it. He was 34 years old and had his mother's eyes and her particular stubbornness, and he had driven the 20 minutes from his place near Uptown the moment Sergeant Morrison called him. Apparently, Catherine had him listed in her phone under the contact labeled simply, "Call first." His eyes were red at the edges. His jaw was set in the way men hold their faces when they are determined not to fall apart in front of someone they love. He stepped inside and put his arms around me, and we stood in the hallway for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing yet that needed to be said. We moved to the living room. The lights stayed off. At some point, Ethan made a fresh pot of coffee, and we drank it in the half-dark, speaking in short sentences when we spoke at all. Silence between us had always been comfortable, one of those things you don't realize you've built until you need it. Around midnight, I looked at my son, his face in shadow, his hands wrapped around his mug, and understood something I had not experienced in 63 years of living. I did not know what came next. Not in the next hour. Not in the next 10 minutes. I had built a career on reading structures, on calculating where the stress would fall, and designing accordingly. This particular fracture had no engineering solution. The only thing I knew with any certainty was that I was grateful he was in the room. Around midnight, I heard Ethan quietly rise from the sofa. I assumed he was going to the kitchen for water. But the footsteps moved in the wrong direction, not toward the kitchen, but down the hall toward Catherine's study. They stopped there for a moment. Just a moment. Then they came back. I told myself that grief makes people do strange things. I believed it too. That was the last night I believed anything so easily. In the 2 weeks after the funeral, I came to understand what a house sounds like when it waits for someone who is never going to come back. It is not what most people imagine. There is no dramatic fracture, no single moment that breaks everything open at once. There is only a slow accumulation of small absences that builds across the length of each morning until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. The coffee maker produces more than one person needs. The newspaper crossword sits open and unfinished. The kitchen chair remains at the slight outward angle Catherine always left it in after breakfast, a habit I had gently complained about for years. I kept meaning to push it back in. Every morning, I looked at it and did not. Pushing it back in would have required making a decision about it, and I was not yet equipped to make decisions about things that small. Ethan had set up to work remotely from my dining room table for most of the 2 weeks. He arranged himself at the cleared end with his laptop and a second monitor. And I will not pretend I did not find it considerably easier to breathe with another person in the house. He cooked simple meals in the evenings, set my blood pressure medication on the counter each morning in plain view, and filled the gas in my car without once mentioning it. None of it was performed. That was the quality I was most grateful for. He also asked questions. Small ones spaced across the days naturally enough that I did not register them as a pattern. Had I spoken to our financial advisor, did I know where Catherine kept the life insurance documents? Had the bank been notified about the accounts? These were the ordinary tasks that follow a death, and someone needed to manage them. Ethan had always been the kind of person who processed loss by attending to the next necessary thing. I was grateful that one of us was handling the logistics while I was still sitting at the center of it all. Diana and Lucas arrived Saturday morning just after 10. Ethan's wife was a warm, clear-eyed woman with a reliable instinct for what a situation required. She came through the door with her arms already open, held on for a long moment, and said 3 words. "We're here." It was exactly the right amount. Their son Lucas had just turned 7 and had inherited his father's serious eyes, along with his mother's irrepressible energy. Sometime in the past year, for reasons he never fully explained, he had made the decision to call me exclusively Grandpa T, a title I had never asked for, and had entirely failed to talk him out of. He came through the door behind his mother, carrying a small travel chess set he had received for Christmas. "Grandpa T," he announced before he had cleared the entryway. "Dad keeps explaining how the night moves, and I'm pretty sure he's getting it wrong." I spent the next 2 hours on the living room floor with the chessboard between us, and those were the 2 best hours I had managed since the morning of the 15th. The following afternoon, I began going through Catherine's closet. I had walked in looking for a spare blanket and ended up standing in front of the hanging rack with an empty cardboard box at my feet. I worked through it the way I work through most problems, methodically, from one end to the other. Her winter coats first, then the blazers, then the items pushed to the back that she hadn't worn in years, but had kept for reasons she had never explained, not once in 34 years of marriage. I folded each piece carefully. It was the only way I knew to do it. Her charcoal gray winter coat, the wide-collared one she had worn every cold season for the past 4 years, felt heavier than it should have. I put my hand into the right pocket and found a piece of paper folded into a small, tight square. It was printed on cream-colored professional letterhead, the kind that comes from a proper office rather than a commercial printer. At the top, in clean serif type, Harrison and Blackwell, Private Legal Services. Below that, a date from 11 months ago, a client reference number, and a balance marked "Paid in Full." The name meant nothing to me. We had used the same family attorney for 22 years. Catherine had always managed our legal and financial matters with full transparency. I had known everything she had ever signed. I stood there for a moment. Then I folded the receipt back along its original crease and put it in the kitchen junk drawer along with the old batteries and the expired coupons. That evening, passing the guest room on my way to the kitchen, I heard Ethan's voice through the slightly open door. He was speaking quietly, a deliberate kind of quiet, the kind a person uses when they are conscious of walls. I stopped in the hallway without meaning to. Not yet, I heard. A pause. He doesn't know. A longer pause. Then I'll keep you updated. I stood there for another moment, then continued to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and reminded myself that Ethan ran project teams across multiple time zones and that late calls were a standard part of his week. It was the most logical explanation. I went back to the living room and read the same page of my book 3 times. Before they left on Sunday afternoon, Lucas presented me with a drawing he had worked on quietly for most of the morning. A woman with brown hair and a wide smile, standing in what appeared to be a garden, holding an open book in both hands. Written carefully across the top, Grandma Catherine. I thanked him the way a man thanks a child when he is concentrating hard on not falling apart. I managed the goodbyes. I held together through Diana's hug at the door and through watching their car turn at the end of the street. Then I went through the back door, sat down on the porch steps in the cold April dark, and let grief do what I had not previously allowed. Not the presentable kind, the other kind. I stayed there until the cold made itself felt, then went inside, washed my face, and went to bed. At 1 a.m, I was still awake, and I found myself thinking about the receipt in the kitchen drawer. Harrison and Blackwell. Private legal services. In 34 years, Catherine had never once consulted an attorney I did not know about. She managed our affairs the way I managed my calculations. Every detail accounted for full transparency between us always. So why had that document been folded into the inner pocket of her coat, as though she had preferred it not to be found? He arrived at 9 a.m, exactly 3 weeks to the day since we had buried Catherine, as though he had been keeping a careful count. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, in a dark suit that had been pressed with the kind of precision that belongs to people who are paid to pay close attention to such things. He had parked a gray sedan at the curb and walked up the front path at a measured, unhurried pace. He carried a slim leather portfolio under one arm. He said his name was James Blackwell. I recognized the name before he had finished saying it. My mind went directly to the kitchen drawer, to the folded receipt I had taken out twice in the past week and put back both times without doing a single thing about it. Harrison and Blackwell Private Legal Services. I had thought about that piece of paper more than I had admitted to myself over the past 3 weeks. I had told myself I was going to look the firm up. I had told myself I was going to call. I had not done either one. Standing in my own doorway on a quiet Thursday morning, I understood that the decision had been made for me. He explained the situation with the measured, rehearsed quality of someone delivering a message he has been trusted with and has had time to prepare for. Catherine had retained his services 8 months prior. She had come to him specifically, he said, not through a referral, not through the firm's general intake, but directly by name, by appointment. She had very specific instructions. If anything were to happen to her within 12 months of their agreement, he was to deliver a sealed envelope to me, her husband, exactly 3 weeks after her funeral. Not 2 weeks, not 1 month, 3 weeks. He had the date noted in writing, and he had kept it. I asked him to repeat that. He did in the same unhurried tone. She had used the phrase, if anything were to happen to her. Those were her exact words. I asked him what was in the envelope. He said he did not know. The envelope had been sealed by Catherine at the time of their meeting. His obligation as retained was delivery, not content. He said this without apology and without elaboration, as someone who had decided in advance that no further explanation was required of him. He cited attorney-client privilege as it applied to the nature of the agreement, and noted that his professional obligation to his client ended the moment the envelope was placed in my hands. He said he was sorry for my loss. He offered his hand. I shook it. He walked back down the front path and drove away without looking back. I stood in the open doorway, holding a white business envelope with my name written across the front in Catherine's handwriting. From upstairs, I could hear the steady, muffled rhythm of Ethan's keyboard through the ceiling. He had mentioned a conference call at 10. It was 9:15. He would not be coming down for a while. I went to the kitchen table and sat down. The envelope was standard letter size sealed. My full name was written across the front, Thomas Gerald Weller, in the careful, slightly forward-leaning script that Catherine had used her entire adult life. I had seen that handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards and the margins of novels for 34 years. I recognized it the way you recognize a voice in a crowded room. I sat with the envelope in my hands for a moment before I opened it. Inside was a small brass key attached to a plain white card, by a short length of string. On the card, in typed characters, 4 Birchwood Lane, Lake Norman, NC. Below the key, folded once, was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Catherine's, unhurried, deliberate, the pen pressed firmly into the page. Come to 4 Birchwood Lane, Lake Norman. Go alone. Do not tell Ethan. You will find your answers there. I read it 3 times. The words did not change. My first instinct, the one that arrived before I had time to examine it, was to fold the note, walk to the foot of the stairs, and call Ethan's name down. 34 years of marriage had built a deep habit in me of bringing problems to the people I trusted most. This was unquestionably a problem. Ethan was perhaps 30 feet above me and could be at this table in under a minute. The part of my mind that had spent 4 decades designing load-bearing structures wanted to lay all the pieces out, examine each one, and figure out what they were being asked to hold. The note said, "Do not tell Ethan." It said it clearly and by name. I read it a 4th time. Then I folded the paper along its original crease and slid it into the breast pocket of my shirt. The key went in after it. I smoothed the fabric over the pocket with one hand and sat there for a moment. Then I picked up the empty envelope and dropped it in the recycling bin under the kitchen sink. I heard Ethan's footsteps on the stairs a few minutes later. He came into the kitchen with the easy movement of someone briefly between tasks, poured himself a fresh cup, and glanced over at where I was sitting. "Who was at the door?" he asked. "Delivery," I said. "Wrong house." He considered this for about half a second, then nodded and finished pouring his coffee. I watched him rinse his empty mug in the sink with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has a clear next task waiting. He carried the fresh cup with him and went back up the stairs. I sat at the kitchen table alone and listened to his footsteps cross the ceiling above me until they settled back into the quiet rhythm of someone at work. It was the first lie I had told my son in 63 years of living. It had come out of my mouth without a pause, without a flinch, as though I had been rehearsing it. The ease of it was the part I could not square even after he was gone. The key pressed against my chest, through the fabric of my shirt, and all through lunch, and all through the long, quiet afternoon, and all through the dinner Ethan prepared without asking what I wanted. It stayed exactly where I had put it. Catherine had retained a private attorney 8 months before she died, with instructions tied specifically and conditionally to the event of her own death. The level of forethought required for that arrangement did not come from nowhere. That kind of planning does not arise accidentally. It comes from anticipating something specific. It comes from being afraid of something you have already named. I did not sleep. By 3 in the morning, I had stopped pretending I was going to, and lay on my back in the dark, with my hands on my chest, and let my mind do what it had been trying to do for several hours. This was not grief. I had come to know grief well enough in the past weeks to recognize its particular weight, its blunt permanence. What kept me awake was something sharper, a question that kept rearranging itself every time I thought I had found a way to hold it still. At 3:15, I reached for my phone and typed in the address, 4 Birchwood Lane, Lake Norman, North Carolina. The results came back immediately organized and indifferent, without any awareness of what they were carrying. The top result was a real estate listing aggregator. I clicked through. The lead photograph showed a small wood-frame cabin set back from the lakeshore surrounded by pines, a narrow dock extending over the water, the kind of place that looks as though it has been there for decades and intends to remain. The tax records appeared on the same aggregator. The property had last sold 26 months prior. In North Carolina, real estate transactions are public record: the sale price, the date of conveyance, the legal description of the parcel. What I could not find was the buyer's name. The deed had been taken in the name of a limited liability company, Lakeview Holdings, LLC, registered in the state. In North Carolina, that is entirely legal. It is also a commonly used method by private buyers who prefer their identity not appear in a public document. I sat with that information for a while. Then I opened our joint bank account. Catherine and I had kept one shared account for 34 years, into which everything went and from which everything came. I scrolled back through 2 years of transaction history, then 3, then 4, looking for anything directed toward a real estate transaction, a wire transfer to a title company, a closing cost, a property tax payment, a utility charge for a second address. I found nothing that matched. Not a single dollar I could connect to the cabin at Lake Norman, which meant that Catherine had a separate account, one I had no access to, one I had not known about. For 34 years, I had believed I held a full and accurate picture of everything material between us. A property purchased through an LLC, funded from an account I had never seen a statement for, that was not an oversight. That was a choice made repeatedly over a considerable period of time. Catherine and I had built our financial life the way we built everything else deliberately, with full visibility on both sides. Every mortgage payment, every car purchase, every vacation and medical bill, and irregular expense above a certain size. If one of us spent more than we had planned on something, the other one knew about it. Not because we required it of each other, simply because that was how we lived. To purchase a property, to form a company, to maintain a separate account across years that required sustained, intentional effort over a long stretch of time. It did not happen without a decision to let it happen. Do not tell Ethan. I lay there in the dark, turning that instruction over slowly. I thought about my son. I thought about the phone call I had heard through the guest room door. Not yet. He doesn't know, I'll keep you updated, and the explanation I had chosen. I thought about his questions in the week after the funeral, the insurance policy, the financial advisor, the accounts. I had been grateful at the time. Looked at now from a different angle in a dark room at 3 a.m, those questions were not quite the same. At 6 a.m, I dressed in the dark, went downstairs, and wrote a note on the yellow notepad Catherine had kept on the kitchen counter for as long as I could remember. Out for groceries, back before noon. I set it where it would catch the light when Ethan came down for coffee. Then I took my keys and my jacket and let myself out of the house into the gray, pre-dawn quiet of the street. I had driven north on I-77 many times, but I had never paid attention to the way the landscape transforms on the approach to Lake Norman. Charlotte released me gradually. The office parks thinning first, then the retail corridors, then miles of undeveloped land, and the pines beginning to appear along both shoulders of the road. Somewhere north of Cornelius, they thickened into something continuous. By the time I turned onto the county road along the eastern shore, the trees pressed close on both sides, and the light through them had the soft, fractured quality of morning in a forest. The lake appeared in glimpses between the trees, gray-green, still the surface barely distinguishable from the pale sky. I passed a locked marina and a boat rental facility, both empty in the early morning. And I found myself thinking a thought I had not expected. How many times had Catherine made this drive? Not in theory. Literally. How many Friday mornings, how many August afternoons, whether she had come alone or with someone. What she had felt when the trees closed in around the road. I turned off the county road onto a narrower lane heading west toward the water, and it occurred to me for the first time that I was doing something I had never done in 34 years of marriage. Going somewhere without telling anyone the truth of where I was going. Every trip I had made, another city a week away, an afternoon errand Catherine had known. Since her death, Ethan had taken that role without either of us naming it. Now I had left a note that said groceries and driven 40 miles north. The solitude of it was something I had no previous name for. I turned onto Birchwood Lane at 7:20. The pines closed in immediately on both sides, dense, the branches nearly meeting overhead. The the morning light reduced to something filtered and green. The lane was unpaved gravel that crackled softly under my tires. At the end of it, set back from the water, was the cabin. Low, wood-sided, a screened porch facing the lake. Beside it sat a vehicle I did not recognize, a dark blue SUV, current North Carolina plates. The interior lights were on. The porch door was propped open. Whoever was inside had been there for some time. I put the car in park and sat for 2 full minutes. In those 2 minutes, I thought about what kind of woman plans, carefully for the possibility of her own death 8 months in advance. And I thought about whether in 34 years of marriage, I had ever actually known her. I got out of the car slowly and closed the door with the kind of care you use when you are approaching something you cannot yet see clearly. The morning air near the water was cool, carrying pine and standing water and the mineral smell of lakestone, the way rural North Carolina smells in April before the day has warmed enough to override it. I stood at the edge of the gravel for a moment and looked at the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected. A single-story wood-frame structure, perhaps 800 square feet, including the screened porch. But smaller was not the same as neglected. The wood siding had been recently stained, no warping at the corners, no rust around the window hardware. The metal roof was clean. The gutters were clear. On the top porch step sat a ceramic pot with a small cluster of yellow pansies that had been watered within the past day or two. Against the left side of the building, a neat stack of cut firewood stood covered by a tarpaulin weighted with stones. Everything here was being maintained with the steady, considered attention you give to something you value and do not discuss. 2 Adirondack chairs sat at the far end of the porch, angled slightly toward the lake. They had been arranged with a specific intention, not placed, but positioned, oriented with care toward the best available view of the water. A small side table between them held an empty glass and a folded cloth, as though someone had been sitting there recently and intended to return. The lake that morning was completely still, a gray-green sheet that reflected the pale early sky without distortion. A heron stood at the edge of the dock, 20 yards out, motionless. The whole scene carried the particular quality of a place that has been found and returned to over the course of many seasons. I looked at the 2 chairs and thought Catherine sat in one of these. I did not know how many times. I did not know which one she chose. I did not know whether she came here in the mornings, when the water had this particular stillness, or in the afternoons, when the light would move differently across the surface. I had been married to her for 34 years, and I had slept beside her, and eaten breakfast with her, and traveled with her, and talked with her about nearly every matter of consequence in our shared life. And I had not known about this. I was standing at the center of a portion of her life I had not been allowed into. I went up the 3 porch steps, crossed the length of the porch, and knocked on the inner door frame, 2 knocks, medium force. The way you announce yourself to a house you have never entered before. Nothing. The screened door between me and the cabin's interior was latched from the inside. I could hear the lake behind me. I could hear the heron lift from the dock and flap out over the water. I stood with the sound of my knock dying in the morning air and waited. I knocked again 3 times, evenly spaced, the kind of pattern that cannot be mistaken for wind or wildlife against the siding. The kind that says there is a person standing here, and they intend to wait. A pause. Then from inside the cabin, footsteps. Light and quick, crossing what sounded like a bare wood floor. Moving with purpose, the sound of someone who had been waiting for this knock, and had been ready for it before it came. Without thinking, I pressed my right hand against my jacket pocket, and felt the shape of the key through the fabric. The reassurance of a small, specific wait. Catherine had sealed it inside an envelope, attached it to an address card, handed it to an attorney with instructions she had paid him to carry out after she was gone. I did not know what it opened inside that cabin, but she had meant for me to have it. Out of everyone she could have chosen, she had given me this key and told me to come alone. I held on to that. I was 63 years old. I had stood on open scaffolding in wind conditions that exceeded building code parameters and assessed compromised structures in the aftermath of two separate flooding events. I had given testimony in front of city review boards with cameras in the room. What I was experiencing now had no professional category I could apply to it. My hands were pressed flat against the sides of my legs. My breathing was shallow and voluntary, the specific deliberate pattern I use when I have decided not to allow something to show on my face. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. A stillness so complete I could hear my own breathing. Then I heard a hand work the interior latch, the small, clean sound metal makes when it moves against metal. The door swung inward. The screened outer door opened toward me. The woman who stood in the frame had brown hair pulled back, was wearing a gray pullover with the sleeves pushed up, and was holding a ceramic mug in both hands. She looked as though she had been awake for some time. She looked as though she had been expecting someone. It took me 2 seconds to process what I was looking at. The woman in the doorway was not a stranger, not an attorney, not someone unfamiliar. She was a woman I had eaten dinner with many times at my own kitchen table. A woman whose wedding I had attended 6 years ago. A woman who had spent a Sunday afternoon on my living room floor with Lucas and a set of colored pencils teaching my grandson how to draw horses. A woman who called me Dad Thomas. Diana, Ethan's wife, my daughter-in-law. She stood in the doorway of a cabin my wife had secretly purchased 2 years before her death, holding a coffee mug, looking at me with an expression I could not name. Not surprise, something more composed, the expression of someone who has been holding something for a long time and can finally see who it belongs to. She said my name, not Dad Thomas, the slightly formal version she always used at family dinners, the one that kept a comfortable distance between us. She said Thomas, plainly, the way you say the name of someone you have been keeping something for. "I've been waiting for you," she said, and in the moment that followed, I understood that whatever was about to happen had been set in motion long before this morning by someone who was no longer here to explain what she had done or why she had done it. She stepped back from the doorway, and I followed her inside, and the first thing I noticed was the table. It was a farmhouse-style piece, solid pine pushed flush against the wall beneath the window that faced the lake. On it, arranged with the kind of deliberateness that does not happen by accident, a sealed cardboard file box, the kind sold at office supply stores. Its lid secured with 2 lengths of rubber band crossing each other at right angles. Beside it, a laptop closed, its power indicator dark. And in the center of the table, a row of envelopes. 4 of them I counted standing upright against the side of the file box, each one sealed. Each one bearing a name written in blue ink, in a hand I recognized, before I had consciously decided to recognize it. Diana set her mug on the kitchen counter and pulled out the chair on the window side of the table. She gestured toward the chair opposite, not the gesture of a host, something more formal than that. The gesture of someone conducting a meeting they did not request and have been preparing for longer than they would have chosen. I sat down. I did not look at the envelopes yet. I looked at her. She was composed in the way people are composed when they have already cried everything they had and come out the other side of it. Her eyes were red at the inner corners, the particular redness of someone who has not slept well for several nights in sequence. The rest of her face was arranged and still. No jewelry, except her wedding ring, which I noticed without knowing why I noticed it. Her hands on the table were folded, but not tightly, the controlled grip of someone who has decided not to grip. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Since yesterday evening," she said. "I drove up after Ethan left for Houston." I understood the implication without having to ask for it directly. She had not told my son she was coming here. She came to me 6 months before she died. Diana did not ease into it. She gave me the sentence that mattered first. Not to the house. She called and asked to meet somewhere private. We met at a coffee shop in Davidson. She drove herself. She did not want anyone to know we had been in contact. I waited. She told me she had discovered something. That there were people not unknown to you, Thomas, who were working towards something that would damage you seriously. Not financially, more than that. She let a small pause sit. She'd been trying to address it herself for 2 years. She said she didn't want to bring it to you until she had the complete picture. Her exact words. If I go to Thomas now before I have proof, I hand someone a warning and protect no one. The lake outside the window held its morning quiet. A thin line of light was beginning to separate the far tree line from the water. Why didn't she tell me? The question came out more flat than I intended. It was not anger. It was the absence of a tone I had not yet decided on. Diana placed her hands flat on the table, palms down. She said the plan was to document everything, verify every piece of it, and then tell you herself. She wanted to be the one sitting across from you. A brief silence. She hoped you would never have to come here. She hoped she would be the one to explain all of it. I looked at the file box. I looked at the envelopes. Why you? I asked. Because she needed someone already inside the situation who wasn't implicated in it. She let that stand on its own before adding, and because I have Lucas to think about. I did not ask her to clarify the second part. The mention of my grandson's name settled into the room, and I chose not to examine it yet. Diana reached across the table and slid the first envelope toward me. It was thicker than the others, 4 or 5 pages folded inside. My name on the front, Thomas, not Dad Thomas, just Thomas, written in Catherine's handwriting, which I had not seen in 7 months, which was still absolutely familiar. The particular downward pressure on the capital T, the small closed loop she always made at the bottom of the letter G, the handwriting of someone I had known for 38 years. I held the envelope for a moment without moving. Then I opened it. 5 pages folded in thirds. I opened them flat against the table. Good paper stock, not printer paper, the heavier cream kind she kept in the drawer beside her desk, for things she considered worth the effort. The first line read, "Thomas, I have loved you for 34 years, and I have been lying to you for nearly every one of them." I read the sentence. I read it again. I set the letter down on the table and looked out the window at the lake. The water had not moved. The line of light along the far bank had extended perhaps another degree. 2 mallards came in low over the surface and landed without sound in the small cove to the left of the dock. Diana did not speak. She sat with her hands flat and waited the patience of someone who has had months to finish grieving the thing I was only now beginning to find the edges of. An engineer does not put a set of drawings down after reading only the first sheet. It does not matter what the structure is or what those first lines suggest about its condition. You see all of it before you decide what is required. That is the discipline. That is the only one that holds. I picked up the letter. I read the first page, then the second. By the third, I understood that what I was holding was not only a confession, it was a record assembled with care cross-referenced, dated. The kind of documentation a person builds when they know they may not be there to testify to it themselves. Evidence, once you are holding it, changes everything you believed you understood about the structure you have been standing inside. Catherine's handwriting was always careful. Each letter formed, round and complete, no rushed abbreviations, no shortcuts taken in the forming of a word. Even in a letter she must have written, knowing she might not be alive when I read it, the penmanship remained precise and controlled. That steadiness had cost her something. I could recognize the cost of it in every line. I turned to the second page and began reading from the beginning. The letter placed me in Atlanta, 1989. A structural engineering conference at a hotel, she named one I recognized, because I had recommended it to her myself when she first mentioned the trip. She had been working for an architectural consulting firm at the time, a junior associate, 3 years before Blackwell Group brought her on as full partner. The conference ran 4 days. I had not gone because we were underwater on a commercial project in Charlotte, roof load miscalculations that required daily site supervision. I had kissed her goodbye at the airport and told her to take notes. The man's name was Victor Hale. He had been presenting on mixed-use residential development finance. They met at one of the evening panels, continued talking after, and the next morning had breakfast together, and then did not stop. She wrote the sequence plainly without over-explaining it 4 months, and then she ended it. She wrote, "I ended it because I understood what it meant, and I chose you." That sentence appeared in the same careful handwriting as everything else on the page. No larger letters, no additional pressure on the pen. She had written it the way you write something you have thought about for so long that it has come to weigh the same as everything else you have ever decided. I set the pages down on the table. Diana looked at me without moving. "How long have you known?" I asked. 6 months, she said. I nodded. I picked the letter up and continued reading. She had discovered she was pregnant approximately 3 weeks after ending the relationship with Hale. She wrote that she counted the dates carefully, precisely, the way she did everything, and arrived at a range that made absolute certainty impossible. I could be the father. Victor Hale could be the father. The range overlapped. She chose to believe it was me. She chose not to confirm. She wrote, "I made a decision, and I chose to live inside it. I did not revisit it. I told myself that was the right thing to do, and I believed it for a long time. Sometimes I still believe it when I am not paying careful enough attention." What followed was a compressed account of 34 years. She watched Ethan grow. She looked for Victor Hale in him in the shape of his jaw in his hands. In the particular way he processed silence before speaking, and she did not find it. She convinced herself over time that the answer had always been obvious, and that she had only failed to see it clearly because she had been frightened once. She wrote, "I loved Ethan completely. I loved you completely." I told myself that the silence was a form of kindness. Then she wrote, "I understand now that it was not only that." The next section changed the weight of everything that preceded it. In 2021, the past found its way back. She did not describe how in this letter, she said the documentation was in the file box. Victor Hale had contacted her directly in the fall of 2022. Not through any attorney, not through any formal channel. He came to her office at Blackwell and sat across from her desk and told her he had reason to believe Ethan was his son. He had information he was prepared to act on. He requested that she establish a trust fund in Ethan's name. In a specific structure, he detailed he named the figures with a transfer mechanism that would give him legal access should Ethan's paternity ever be formally established. He presented this as a reasonable arrangement. He was calm throughout the meeting, controlled. The specific calm of a person who has already determined what happens if the answer is no. She refused. He thanked her. He left without argument. That was what frightened her. Not the demand, the departure. Within 6 weeks, an attorney representing Hale had sent a letter to Blackwell Group's general counsel framed as a preliminary inquiry in advance of a potential paternity action, but specific in its questions about Catherine's estate structure and beneficiary arrangements. She had retained someone named Calloway, she wrote, that his full analysis was in the file box, and Calloway had explained what the inquiry actually indicated. Victor Hale was not preparing to go to court. He was preparing to act after she was no longer in the picture. The legal correspondence was scaffolding, not the threat itself. He was building framework for afterward. She wrote, "I do not know whether what I feared has come to pass. But I know enough about Victor Hale to understand that a man with his history and his level of desperation does not accept a refusal and walk quietly away from it." If you are reading this letter, Thomas, then I was not wrong to be afraid. The final paragraph of the first section read, "Before you open the next envelope, I need you to know that what I did in 1989 is mine to carry. What was built around it in the years since then, what grew from it without your knowledge, what was decided on your behalf without your consent, that is not. Whatever you choose to do with what you find in that box, be braver than I was." I folded the pages carefully along their original creases and placed them on the table. I looked out the window at the lake. An engineer understands when a structure has reached its designed load-bearing limit. It is not always visible from the outside. Sometimes there is no crack, no audible shift, no dramatic failure. Sometimes the structure simply arrives at the precise point where everything it was designed to carry is now exactly more than it was built to hold. I was sitting at that point. I knew it the way you know it. Not with panic, but with the quiet, complete recognition that the calculation you have been running for most of your life has finally fully resolved itself. Diana reached into the file box and set a second envelope on the table beside my hand. The label on the front was printed in the flat, institutional typeface of a medical laboratory. Nothing handwritten, nothing warm, no trace of the careful letters Catherine had spent a lifetime forming. It read, "Paternity Analysis Report Confidential." I looked at it for a long moment. There are things that once opened cannot be closed again. I opened it. Before I open that envelope with you, comment 99 below, so I know you haven't left. You followed Thomas this far. What's on that page is the moment the whole story turns. One note: parts of this story are fictional, woven in for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson underneath it is worth holding on to. The report was 3 pages single-spaced, formatted with the cold precision of every technical document I had read across 40 years of engineering work. Results like these do not speak for themselves. They sit on the page and wait for you to understand what they mean. The laboratory was private-based in Atlanta. I noted the address in the header without meaning to the professional habit of filing a source before evaluating its content. The report was dated 14 months ago. Catherine had ordered it through an intermediary service. The covering letter made that clear, and had the results delivered to a post office box in Mooresville, not to the house on Selwyn, not to Blackwell Group. She had planned the receipt of this information with the same deliberateness she had brought to everything else in that file box. The samples were labeled by initials only. Sample A hair labeled EW, Sample B hair labeled VH. A third comparison sample labeled TW had been submitted alongside them. The analysis ran 2 dense pages of statistical methodology that I moved through without slowing because I understood the structure of the language, and what followed was a single paragraph of conclusions. Probability of paternity between Sample B and Sample A, 99.97%. The final notation read, "Comparison sample TW does not indicate a biological relationship with subject EW consistent with first-degree paternity." I read the document through once. I read it a second time more slowly. Because the first pass, I had allowed myself to move too quickly, the way you read something you are not yet ready to fully absorb. The third time I read it straight through without stopping at anything. Then I set it face down on the table. I stood up and went to the window. The lake outside had begun to catch the morning light properly. The flat gray-green of early morning giving way to something warmer, the surface starting to hold color instead of just reflecting the sky. A light wind was crossing the cove, small, even ripples moving left to right, regular as a measurement. I stood and watched them, and did not attempt to think about what I had just read, because there was no thinking required. The document had been written to eliminate ambiguity. It had performed that function completely. What I thought about instead was a late Saturday morning in September of 1996 on a flat stretch of pavement in the Dilworth neighborhood. Ethan was 6 years old. We had found the block because Catherine had read that children learned most easily on level ground with no incline. He had been furious at the training wheels for 2 full weeks, furious at them specifically, and furious at himself in the way that 6-year-olds are furious when the gap between what they want to do and what they can do is visible to other people. That morning we removed them. I ran alongside him for half the length of the block, with one hand at the back of his seat. And then, at the right moment, I let go without telling him I had. He rode another 100 feet before he registered that he was doing it alone. The sound he made when he realized it was not the sound of a child. It was something that came from further down than that. I thought about a Tuesday afternoon in the driveway off Providence Road. Ethan was 16, and I set a key ring in his open hands and said nothing else. And he looked down at it for a long moment, and then looked up at me, and also said nothing because we both understood that some exchanges do not improve with words. I thought about a Thursday in March 7 years ago, when my phone rang in the parking lot of a Harris Teeter on Park Road. I was at the trunk of the car loading groceries. The number was a hospital exchange I didn't recognize. I answered, and it was Ethan's voice, and the first thing he said was, "Daddy's here. Lucas is here." I had stood with my hand on the trunk lid and cried in a way I had not cried since the morning of my own father's funeral. I stood there until I was finished. Then I finished loading the groceries and drove home. None of that changed what the page said. I was clear on that. The clarity was not comfortable, but it was complete. I turned away from the window and sat back down. "When did Catherine have this done?" I asked. "But last year," Diana said. She told me she ordered it because she needed to stop wondering. She said she had spent 34 years choosing to believe one thing, and she needed to know whether what she had chosen was true. A brief pause. The results settled it. Not in the way she had hoped. I kept my eyes on the table. Who else knows? Ethan knows. Her hands remained flat on the surface between us. He found out in 2021. Not from this test, he came to it through something separate on his own. But he knows. I held that for a moment. Ethan had known for 4 years. He had known while standing in my kitchen eating meals I had prepared. He had known when he called on my birthday. He had known at Catherine's funeral and at the graveside, and when he placed his hand on my shoulder in the way a son does when he is standing beside his father. I kept my voice level. I kept it level with the specific, deliberate effort of a person who understands that 1 full second of losing control means not being able to locate the floor again afterward. "Diana," I said. "What exactly did Ethan do when he found out?" The way she stopped before answering told me more than the answer itself. There is a particular kind of pause that occurs when someone is about to hand you the final load-bearing piece of information, the element that will determine whether the whole structure holds or comes apart, along lines that have always been present, invisible waiting. I had been in enough assessment reviews to recognize that pause from across a table. I waited. Diana told me the story in the exact sequence it happened, and I listened the way I have learned to listen when someone hands me drawings for a building I did not know existed, without interrupting, without offering the corrections I was already assembling, because the corrections could wait, and the full picture could not. In the summer of 2021, Ethan had seen something he was not meant to see. He had been driving back from a job site in the early evening a Tuesday, Diana thought, though she was not certain of the day, and he had passed a coffee shop on the Davidson Highway and seen his mother's car in the parking lot. She had told him she was working late. He had pulled over. He had waited. He had watched Catherine come out with a man he did not recognize talk with him for several minutes at the edge of the lot, and then leave in separate cars. he had not confronted her immediately. He had done what Ethan always did, which was to gather more before he spoke. He researched the man from the partial plate he had noted. It took 3 weeks. He came to Catherine on a Sunday morning when I was out of the house. He named Victor Hale. He laid out what he had found. Catherine had told him everything. She had asked him not to tell me. She had explained that she was already handling the situation. She had asked for time. Ethan had given it to her. I believe he meant to protect her, Diana said, and you. I think he believed that if he held it together long enough, Catherine would find a way through it, and no one would need to know. A pause. And then Victor contacted him directly. When, January 2022, 8 months before Victor went to Catherine's office, Diana opened the laptop and inserted a small USB drive. She typed a password and opened a folder containing a column of audio files, each labeled with a date and nothing else. She selected the first one. She pressed play. The sound quality was clear. Ethan had been recording his own calls. Diana told me later that he had started doing it 3 months in, when something Victor said made him uneasy, and he could not name why. A party to the conversation recording it. Legal in North Carolina. A telephone recording with both ends captured the slight ambient difference between 2 separate rooms. The first voice I heard was Ethan's, and it reached me the way his voice always does when I am not expecting it. The specific register of it, the particular weight he puts on the first word of a sentence. I needed no time to identify it. You do not need time with a voice you have known since it was not yet formed. The second voice was lower, unhurried, measured in the way of someone who has thought through every direction a conversation might go before it begins. Victor Hale asked about my retirement accounts, the structure of them, the managing institutions, the designated beneficiaries. Ethan answered. Victor asked about the investment portfolio, approximate value, the brokerage, the account type. Ethan answered. Victor asked about life insurance, primary beneficiary, secondary, whether the policies carried double indemnity provisions. Ethan answered all of it, patiently, completely, with the particular calm of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the other side of it. I sat and listened to my son describe the architecture of my financial life to a man I had never met, and I felt something shift in my chest that had no name I was prepared to assign to it. Not yet. There are structural failures that must be observed in their full sequence before you can classify them. I observed. Diana played 2 more files. The same pattern, different dates, Victor asking, Ethan answering. The 2 of them moving through the material with a shared efficiency that accumulates only across time and repetition. They had done this before. Many times before. Then she opened the file labeled October of last year. The first portion was procedural. I had stopped tracking the content closely and was listening instead to the rhythm of the exchange, the fluency of it, the way a shorthand had developed between them. Then Victor said something that changed the quality of the air in the room. He said, when Catherine is no longer in the way, everything becomes considerably simpler. Your position as his only son makes the rest of it straightforward. We only need to be a little more patient. Ethan said nothing in response. The recording held that silence for 4 or 5 full seconds, long enough to be a considered silence, not an accidental one. The file ended. Diana closed the laptop. The cabin went completely quiet. I could hear the wind coming off the lake against the screened porch. I could hear my own breathing. I sat with what I had heard and did not move and did not speak, because there was a sequence that had to finish before anything else could begin. The recording was dated 6 months before Catherine's accident. I looked at Diana. I kept my voice at the register I had maintained since I walked through that door, because it was the only one I had left, and I knew I needed to hold it. Diana, I said. The accident. Was it actually an accident? Diana did not answer directly. She told me that Catherine had believed she was in danger, believed it clearly and specifically enough to build this entire file to retain Calloway, to place Diana here in this cabin with instructions to wait for me. But she had not been able to prove what she feared. That was why she had asked Calloway to keep working. That was why the attorney's instructions had specified me alone and this address. Diana slid the file box across the table toward me. Take all of it, she said. There's one more person you need to speak with before you decide what to do. She picked up a pen. She wrote on the notepad beside the laptop. 2 lines tore the sheet off cleanly and slid it across after the box. Ray Calloway. Calloway Investigations, Charlotte, N.C. I picked up the piece of paper. I folded it once and placed it in the breast pocket of my jacket beside the key that had brought me here. I drove home on the same road I had driven north on that morning, 40 miles back, through the pine corridors and the narrowing highway, and it was not the same road at all. I did not turn the radio on. I drove with the sound of the engine and the tires on the pavement and nothing else. The file box was in the trunk, inside a canvas bag Diana had provided without being asked. I was aware of its weight back there in the way you are aware of something you have chosen to put at a distance for the next 40 minutes, because 40 minutes was all I had before I would need to be something specific for someone specific. I passed the interchange at exit 41. The section of I-85 where Catherine's car had left the roadway on a Tuesday morning in April was approximately 2 miles north of that exchange. I did not look. I kept both hands on the wheel and held the posted speed and drove straight through. Ethan's car was in the driveway when I pulled up. A light was on in the kitchen. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before going inside long enough to do the necessary work of arranging my face into something that could sit across a table from my son and hold its shape through an entire meal. I took the canvas bag from the trunk and went upstairs first. I placed it in the back of the bedroom closet behind the dry cleaning I had not yet retrieved, and the set of luggage Catherine and I had last used for a trip to Portland 4 years ago. I closed the closet door. I washed my face at the bathroom sink. I went back downstairs. Ethan had made pasta. A simple marinara, the recipe Diana had taught him in the 2nd year of their marriage. The kitchen smelled of garlic and the particular warmth of a meal cooked by someone who was trying in the only way available to him that evening to do something that felt like a reasonable gesture. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. He told me about Lucas's soccer game the following weekend. The coach had moved Lucas to center mid-ta, which Ethan thought was probably the right decision given how the boy read the field. I said that sounded right. He said they were thinking of driving up Saturday morning and staying the night if the weather held. I said that sounded like a good plan. I ate my pasta. I asked whether he had heard back from the contractor on the basement waterproofing quote. He had come in higher than expected, but not unreasonably. I said I could look over the scope if he wanted a second opinion on the numbers. He said that would be helpful. We talked about none of the things that existed between us in that room. We talked about everything that was available to 2 people when one of them is holding something the other believes he does not yet know. It was the most sustained and careful performance of my adult life, and I completed it without incident. And when Ethan cleared the plates, I thanked him for dinner and meant it. Because whatever else was true, he had come here and cooked a meal. And I understood that was its own kind of statement even if neither of us would name it. He told me he had an early call in the morning, a project team in Denver, 7 o'clock. He asked if I needed anything before he headed up. I said I was fine. He came around the side of the table and put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way he had done at the graveside, and I sat still and let him. And then he went upstairs, and I listened to his footsteps cross the floor above me and stop. The house settled into the specific quiet of a place that has been occupied and is now occupied by fewer people than it was built for. I sat with it for a few minutes. Then I got my laptop from the counter and opened the file Diana had transferred to a separate drive before I left a complete copy of the file box, contents compressed and password protected. Catherine had organized it with the same precision she brought to everything labeled sequenced, no ambiguity in the naming. Victor Hale's file came first. A federal fraud conviction, Northern District of Georgia, 2009. 3 counts: investment misrepresentation and improper use of client funds through a development company he had operated in Atlanta since 2004. Sentenced to 4 years. Served 3 at a federal correctional facility in Jessup. Released 2012 on supervised terms. The original company dissolved before sentencing. A second entity, identically structured, appeared in Delaware filings 18 months after his release. A third after that. Bankruptcy filed 2019, Northern District of Georgia. Assets negligible. Liabilities significant. Following the bankruptcy, a cluster of limited liability companies, all routed through a single registered agent in Wilmington. Delaware, the standard architecture for entities whose purpose is to hold assets at arm's length from accountability. Catherine's notes listed them in a column with dates and state registration numbers. Near the bottom of the list, marked with a single pencil line, Halcyon Road, LLC. Registered 2021. I searched the name. The registered agent was a Delaware incorporation firm with a suite number in Wilmington and no operational connection to the entities it maintained. Standard arrangement. I noted the entity number, the registration date, and the active status. Then I opened a second tab. I was not certain what I expected to find. I typed the name of the LLC into the search field and looked at what came back. And near the bottom of the first page, there was an archived brief from a Charlotte news outlet, dated April of 2024, 2 sentences from a local traffic incident follow-up. A commercial truck had been identified by witnesses at the scene of a collision on the 285 northbound and had left before officers arrived. The vehicle's registration had subsequently been traced to Halcyon Road, LLC, of Wilmington, Delaware. The investigation had been referred to the State Highway Patrol. No further updates were on record. I looked at the screen. 3 points, 1 straight line. The geometry was not complicated. It had never been complicated. What it had been was incomplete, and now it was not. I sat in the light of the laptop for 5 minutes without moving the house dark around me, and let the structure settle into its final configuration. A kite engineer sits with a completed load analysis the same way, not rushing to conclusion because the conclusion has already resolved itself, and what remains is only the decision about what to do with it. At the bottom of Catherine's file, placed after everything else, was a business card. Ray Calloway. Calloway Investigations, Charlotte, NC. On the back in her handwriting. He knows what I couldn't prove on my own. I set the card on the table in front of me. Tomorrow I would call him. Tonight I needed to sit with what I already knew, because once I made the next call, everything would accelerate, and there would be no version of this in which I could choose not to know the rest of it. I told Ethan I had an appointment with a financial advisor. That was the 3rd lie I had told him in a week. I was aware the lies were becoming easier to deliver, and I had not yet decided whether that was a skill I was developing or a warning I was not paying sufficient attention to. The diner Calloway had named was on Park Road, a narrow storefront with no signage legible from the street, the kind of place that has been in the same location long enough that it no longer needs to advertise its existence to the people who use it. He was already in the far corner when I walked in. He had chosen the seat facing the door, which told me something about the habits formed over a long career that never fully release. Ray Calloway was in his mid-60s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent decades in rooms waiting for information to arrive. He was not what I had assembled in my head during the drive over. He wore a flannel shirt. He had a cup of coffee and a legal pad on the table, the pad open to a blank top sheet. He did not stand when I sat down. He said, "Mr. Weller." I said, "Calloway." He poured me coffee from the carafe without asking. "Catherine hired me 8 months before she died," he said. He did not ease into it. He was, I would understand, over the next hour, not a person who eased into anything. She came to my office with a name, a company structure she'd partially mapped herself, and a concern she couldn't substantiate. She wanted the gaps filled, and she wanted documentation that would hold up if she ever needed to hand it to someone. To whom? She didn't say. She told me she would know when the time came. He turned the legal pad toward me, a column of dates down the left margin, company names in the center, and a pencil line connecting them backward from Halcyon Road LLC through 2 intermediate holding entities to a Delaware limited partnership carrying Victor Hale's name on a 2014 formation document. The truck on I-85 was registered to Halcyon Road when it crossed into North Carolina. By the following morning, the registration had been transferred to a second entity. I found the original filing through a state archive request. It takes time, but it doesn't disappear. "You confirmed Hale controls it." I confirmed he was the sole beneficial owner of the LP that controls the LLC. 3 layers out. Standard structure for someone who has been through federal court and understands how to put distance between himself and an asset. He folded both hands around his cup. The driver cleared the scene in under 2 minutes. No witness captured a full plate. The interchange surveillance caught the rear quadrant of the vehicle consistent with descriptions, not definitive on its own. Whoever drove that truck did not leave in a panic. There was an exit planned before the event. That is not the behavior of a mistake. That is the behavior of a plan. I let that sit for a moment. "Why didn't you take this to the police?" "Because Mrs. Weller asked me not to." "Not yet." He said it without apology or elaboration. She wanted a complete file. She had seen what happens when someone arrives with incomplete evidence against a party that has time and resources to prepare a counter-narrative. She wanted to walk in with everything, or she didn't want to walk in at all. A pause. She ran out of time before the file was complete. Her instructions to me were to continue until it was. And now it is. Now it is. He set the cup down precisely. Victor Hale has been to Charlotte twice since the accident. The first time was 6 weeks afterward. I tracked a rental to a hotel off Billy Graham Parkway. He stayed 2 nights. I was not able to establish who he met during that visit. The second, Calloway reached inside his jacket and produced a photograph 4x6, printed cleanly, corners uncreased. He set it on the table and slid it across without comment. The way people pass things when they understand that commentary is not what is needed. The image had been taken from across the street, with a telephoto lens, slight compression, adequate clarity throughout. The exterior of a coffee shop on Providence Road. I recognized the signage at the left edge of the frame. The shot was angled to capture both the facade and the interior through the large front window that ran the length of the building. On the sidewalk outside, a man I recognized from the photographs in Catherine's file. Victor Hale. Heavier than his 2009 court documents, showed wearing a gray jacket, both hands in his pockets. The posture of someone waiting without appearing to wait. Through the window at the table directly behind him, 2 people seated across from each other, visible from the chest up. The image was sharp enough to work with. One of them I did not recognize. The other was my son. I held the photograph and gave it the attention you give to something you need to document completely before you allow yourself any response. Ethan was in a slight three-quarter profile to the camera. He was wearing the dark blue jacket he put on most weekdays. His hands were on the table. He appeared to be listening to the person across from him with the focused attention of a man engaged in the business being conducted at that table. He did not look coerced. He did not look reluctant. He looked like someone who had chosen to be exactly where he was. The photograph had been taken 3 days ago. 3 days ago while I was in this city. While he was in the house on Selwyn. While the kitchen still smelled faintly of garlic from the pasta he had made for his father. Who's the second person? My voice stayed where I needed it. Still working on that, Calloway said. That's the piece I don't have yet. I looked at the photograph once more. Then I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Calloway watched me without comment. I left him with my card and the understanding that he would call when he had the identification. I drove back on Park Road, with the photograph beside the folded sheet Diana had written on and the key that had started all of this. I was assembling my own file now, the same discipline I apply before any major structural assessment. Every element in sequence, every connection traced, every load path mapped before committing to a course of action. An engineer does not move on a structure until the calculations are finished. I was close, but I was not finished yet. I came home and found Ethan at the stove with his back to me, stirring something in the large white pot Catherine had bought from a kitchen shop on Providence Road. And the ordinariness of it, the smell of onion and broth rising from that particular pot. The way he moved through her kitchen with the ease of someone who had navigated it for years was the strangest thing I had encountered in a week of strange things. I hung my jacket on the hook by the back door. I felt the weight of the photograph shift in the inside pocket and heard the small, specific sound of it settling against the lining. Chicken soup. Ethan said without turning around. I found a rotisserie in the fridge. That was from Tuesday, I said. I checked. It's fine. I sat down at the kitchen table and watched him work the way he reached for the correct cabinet without looking the particular grip he had on the spoon. The way he moved between the counter and the stove with the practiced ease of a sequence repeated until it becomes physical memory. And I tried to hold both versions of him at the same time. The one standing at this stove in his father's kitchen. The one on the audio file, patient and precise, answering Victor Hale's questions about my retirement structure in the measured tone of a man conducting a transaction he had authorized through some private internal process long before the call began. I could not make them resolve into each other. Both were true, and that was the specific thing I had to sit with. While the soup was finishing, certain details returned with a clarity they had not carried at the time. The previous spring, Ethan had offered to help me review my estate documents, not unusual in framing, a son looking out for a recently widowed father, and had asked specifically whether the beneficiary designations on the retirement accounts had been updated since Catherine's death. I had told him I'd had the attorney handle it. He had nodded and let it go. I had taken the absence of follow-up as consideration. I could see it differently now. A telephone call 2 months ago, late in the evening. I had come downstairs for water and heard his voice from the living room. Low-clipped the cadence of someone reporting rather than conversing. I had registered it as a work call and gone back upstairs without thinking further. There were other moments, smaller ones, that I had filed and not returned to because they had not yet had a category to occupy. They had a category now. We ate at the table. Neither of us made an effort to fill the silence. It had been developing between us for some time, and only I knew it had a different shape than it appeared to. His phone rang at 8:45. He looked at the screen and smiled, the real one, the one he has had since he was a child, the one that appears about half a second before he expects it to. He held the phone toward me. Lucas. I took it. My grandson was sitting cross-legged on his bed, with a textbook open in front of him, and the expression of concentrated frustration I had seen on his father's face in September of 1996, on a flat stretch of pavement in the Dilworth neighborhood. He was working on a history project, the American Revolution, specifically on Paul Revere, and he wanted to understand why it mattered how many lanterns were lit if everyone already knew the British were coming. If they already knew, he said, why did the number of lights matter? I told him that knowing something is happening and knowing the specific form it will take are two different categories of knowledge. I told him that a warning which gives you time to position a precise response is worth substantially more than a general alarm. I walked him through the signal system, what it was designed to communicate about the British route out of Boston, why the land crossing and the sea crossing required different defensive preparations, why one lantern without the other would have been an incomplete picture. He asked follow-up questions. He wrote something in the margin of the textbook. We were on the call for 20 minutes. He called me Grandpa T the way he has since he was old enough to shorten names on his own authority. For those 20 minutes, the specific weight that had been sitting in my chest since I got out of the car at the cabin did not make itself felt. I noticed that afterward, in the way you notice what has temporarily lifted, only once the pressure returns. After Ethan went upstairs, I put on a jacket and went out through the back door and stood in the yard for a while. The April air was cool, still carrying the specific uncertainty of a month that has not yet committed fully to warmth, and the neighboring yards were dark and quiet on either side. I stood on the back step and looked at the sky above the tree line and thought about Margaret Collins. Margaret had been my attorney for 15 years. Real estate transactions, mostly construction contracts, a boundary dispute in 2014, lease reviews for the commercial properties I had managed before selling them. She was methodical and did not overcomplicate situations that did not require it. She would know what this had become. Whether she handled it herself or directed me to someone whose practice was built for this specific territory, she would know the correct first step. I found her card in my wallet and set it on the kitchen counter. I did not call tonight. Tonight I had one more hour of work to do, and the call would keep until morning. I sat down at the desk in the study and took a legal pad from the drawer. I dated the top of the first sheet. Then I wrote. I began at the beginning, the key inside the envelope, the address card, the morning at the cabin, and worked forward through each element in the sequence it had arrived. Diana's explanation, the recordings, the DNA report, Callaway's documentation, the vehicle registration, the archived incident, brief the photograph taken 3 days ago on Providence Road. I wrote Ethan's name where it belonged in the sequence. I wrote it without pausing, because pausing was not what the exercise required. By 2 in the morning, I had 8 pages. I set the pen down and went back to the first sheet and read the entire document through. I had done enough of these assessments to know the difference between looking at components in sequence and seeing a structure in its full form, reading the document from the beginning. As a complete record, rather than as a series of arriving pieces, the shape of the whole thing became visible. Not the weight of any single element, the architecture of all of it together, what had been built around Catherine over the course of years, and what had been built around me by people I had trusted without examining the load they were carrying. The scale of it was larger than any individual piece had suggested. I turned off the desk lamp. I sat in the dark with what I had written for a while and let the full structure settle. Tomorrow I would call Margaret. And then step by careful step, I would do what Catherine had asked of me through the building of that file, make sure the people with the authority and standing to act on it understood what had been done to her. I owed her that. Whatever else was true about 34 years of a life we had shared, and there was much that was true that I had not yet fully processed, I owed her at least that much. Margaret Collins had been my attorney for 15 years, and in all that time I had never seen her display an evident reaction to anything. Good news, bad news. A contract dispute that should have been straightforward and was not, or the morning I was about to bring her, Her office was on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse, with a view of the uptown skyline that she had never, in my experience, commented on. The conference room she used for client meetings was quiet, in the specific way that rooms with good insulation and no window to the hallway are quiet, the kind of silence that is not accidental but has been arranged. A carafe of water sat on the table. She closed the door and sat across from me without preliminary. I had rehearsed the sequence during the drive over. I presented it that way in order without editorializing the way I would present findings to a structural review board. I set the physical documents on the table as I reached each one the audio file transcripts Diana had printed from the recordings, Calloway's written report with the vehicle registration chain. The archived news briefed the photograph taken 3 days ago on Providence Road and the 8 pages of indexed notes I had written the previous night. I talked for 22 minutes without interruption. Margaret made notes on her own legal pad, referenced specific pages as I moved through the material, and asked 3 questions, each one precise. Each one aimed at something I had not yet fully addressed. When I finished, she set her pen down. She looked over the material for another 4 minutes without speaking. I had learned across 15 years not to interpret her silences as uncertainty. The chain from Halcyon Road, LLC, back to Hale is 3 entities deep, she said finally. That's going to require forensic accounting work to establish for a jury, but it's traceable, and you have Calloway's documentation as a starting point. The vehicle registration is circumstantial on its own. She paused. The recordings change that substantially. What the recordings give you is motive planning and a demonstrated pattern of coordinated action between Hale and your son that predates the accident by more than a year. When you put those 2 things together, the vehicle evidence and the recordings, you have a circumstantial case that is considerably more than circumstantial. Is it enough to open a criminal investigation? It's enough for homicide detectives to work with, yes. Whether the district attorney takes it to trial is a different question, and that depends on what their investigators develop independently. But to initiate, yes. What you have here establishes probable cause at minimum. She moved to the second part without being asked. Your son's exposure depends on what the investigators can establish about his knowledge of the specific act. The recordings place him in a coordinated financial conspiracy with Hale that is documentable, and it is serious. If the investigation establishes that he had prior knowledge of the accident itself, the charges escalate significantly. She said it the way she said everything plainly without softening the edges. You should understand that whatever happens with the criminal matter, his civil liability is also substantial. Victor Hale's objective, as far as the documentation indicates, was to access the assets in your wife's estate through Ethan's position as her primary beneficiary. The figure Calloway identified in the company filings is consistent with the net value of her estate. A pause. Approximately $2.1 million. I had not seen that number written down before. It sat on the table between us for a moment. My recommendation is that we go to Charlotte Mecklenburg this afternoon, Margaret said. Homicide Division. I'll accompany you. We present the complete file, and I stay with you through the interview. She had already moved to the logistical register, which was how I knew she had finished the assessment. I need to call ahead and identify the right detective to route this to. There's a senior investigator in the unit I've worked with twice before on cases involving financial crimes alongside violent offenses. She's the right person. I said that was fine. Margaret picked up her pen, uncapped it, and set it down again. One other thing. She reached beside her legal pad and produced a single folded document that had not been on the table when I came in. I called Blackwell's general counsel this morning before you arrived. Catherine and I had spoken once years ago about updating her professional directives. She had given me the name of the person I could contact there if it was ever relevant. Skita, she slid the document across the table. He confirmed this exists and provided a copy. It arrived at Blackwell 6 months before Catherine died. The document was a letter from a law firm in Atlanta, 2 paragraphs formal, in structure addressed to Blackwell Group's general counsel. It inquired, on behalf of a named client, whose description matched Victor Hale's profile without using his name directly, about Catherine's estate planning arrangements and any existing provisions for the disposition of her professional partnerships and financial interests. The framing was that of preliminary research ahead of a potential legal action. The specific questions it asked were not the questions of someone preparing to sue. They were the questions of someone preparing to be a beneficiary. The letter was dated October of the previous year, 6 months before Catherine died. The same October as the recording. I read it once. I folded it along its original crease and placed it with the rest of the documents. Catherine had written, "I do not know whether what I feared has come to pass. But if you are reading this, then I was not wrong to be afraid." She had not been wrong about any of it. Not the danger, not the intent, not the sequence. She had assembled the correct picture from the inside of it without Calloway's documentation, without the phone records, without the photograph from Providence Road. She had seen it clearly, and she had been right, and she had run out of time to tell me in the way she had intended. I sat with that for a moment. Then I gathered the documents and put them in order. In the elevator going down, Margaret looked at the display above the doors and said, "You handled this extremely well, Thomas. Most people confront their son first and lose the evidence before they understand what they have." I said, "I'm an engineer. I build things that hold weight. You have to know what you're working with before you move a single piece." What I did not say was this: every hour I had spent building the case was an hour I had not been required to sit with the fact that the person I needed to be most careful around was the same person I had taught to ride a bicycle on a flat stretch of pavement in a neighborhood he had grown up in, on a Saturday morning while his mother waited for us at the end of the block. The elevator reached the lobby. We walked out into the morning. Margaret came with me as she had offered. We walked in on a Tuesday morning, the way you walk into something when you already understand that it will change the shape of everything that follows, and you go anyway, because the alternative is worse. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department headquarters on East Trade Street was not what I would have designed for that purpose. The lobby was functional in the way that buildings are functional when they have been expanded and modified too many times across too many budget cycles. Margaret gave her name at the front desk, and we were escorted upstairs without waiting. The person who appeared in the elevator was not an assistant. It was Adrienne Harris herself. She was in her late 40s, compact, with the particular quality of stillness I had come to associate with people who have trained themselves to reveal nothing during working hours. She was wearing a dark blazer and no jewelry except a watch which she did not look at. She shook Margaret's hand, then mine, and said she had been expecting us, and led us to a conference room at the back of the floor, with a window that faced another building 10 feet away. Her partner, a younger man named Reyes, was already inside with a legal pad and a digital recorder on the table. Harris gestured for us to sit. She sat opposite, uncapped her pen, and said, "Want, take me through it from the beginning." I did. I had organized the physical documents into a sequence the previous afternoon, each one labeled, each transition point, marked with a brief notation on an index card that Margaret had suggested. I worked through it in the order the evidence had arrived: the key, the cabin, Diana's account, the recordings, the DNA documentation, Calloway's report, the vehicle registration chain, the archives, brief, the photograph from Providence Road. Margaret's obtained copy of the letter Victor's attorney had sent to Blackwell 6 months before Catherine died. I finished in 31 minutes. Neither Harris nor Reyes had spoken since I began, except when Reyes asked me to slow down twice to ensure the recorder was capturing clearly. Harris looked at the document spread across the table for a long moment. She looked at individual pieces and then at the sequence as a whole, the way someone does when they are mapping a structure in their head, rather than viewing it in pieces. Then she asked her first question. The audio recordings, how were they captured? My son recorded his own calls. He had been doing it for several months. He kept the files and turned them over to us. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, Margaret added. A party to the conversation recording it. The recordings are legally obtained. I know the statute, Harris said, not dismissive, clarifying. She moved to the next question. The vehicle registration transfer, you have Calloway's documentation here. How did he establish the original registration at the time of the incident, given the transfer had already been processed by the following morning? He submitted a state archive request for the registration history. The filing shows both the original record and the transfer timestamped. Harris wrote something. The photograph from Providence Road, who took it and what equipment was used. Calloway. He can provide the equipment details and precise coordinates if you need them. We'll contact him directly. She made another notation. The letter from Hale's attorney to Blackwell Group's general counsel. How did you obtain a physical copy? My attorney requested it from the general counsel this week, I said. Catherine had established the contact as part of her own documentation effort. The original is on file at Blackwell. Harris set her pen down flat on the table. It was the first decisive movement she had made since we sat down. The chain of custody on most of this is non-standard, she said. That's not an obstacle, it's a condition we work with. Defense attorneys will challenge the sourcing of documentation gathered by a private investigator and obtained under circumstances that weren't court-supervised, and we have to anticipate that. She looked at me directly. What you've brought me is a solid starting point. The audio recordings create a documented motive and a pattern of premeditated coordination that the vehicle evidence alone couldn't establish. That combination is meaningful. What I need to tell you is that we will conduct our own independent investigation of every element in this file before we present anything to the district attorney's office. I understand. I also need to tell you something else. She folded her hands on the table. You are not to contact Victor Hale directly or indirectly, and you are not to contact your son regarding this matter. No conversations, no written communications, no intermediaries. If either of those men contacts you, you do not engage, you document the contact, and you call me immediately. She slid a card across the table. My direct number. Not the main line. Mine. I said I understood. One more thing, she said. You don't discuss this meeting. Not with neighbors, not with colleagues, not with anyone who isn't your attorney. If the people we're looking at have any indication that this file exists or that an investigation has been initiated, the evidentiary trail becomes significantly more complicated to preserve. I had spent 3 weeks not letting anything show at a dinner table. The instruction was not a difficult one. In the parking lot outside the building, Margaret stopped beside her car. She stood for a moment, looking at the entrance we had come out of. Catherine chose the right person to leave that key to, she said. I looked at the building entrance for a moment. She chose someone who knew how to wait, I said. That's all it was. Margaret nodded once and got in her car. I got in mine. I drove exactly 2 blocks north on Tryon before I pulled into a loading zone on the right side of the street and stopped. I turned the engine off. I sat there with my hands in my lap and the engine quiet around me. I needed 60 seconds with no one present to observe what 60 seconds without a required performance felt like. And that was what I allowed myself. The phone rang on the seat beside me. Unknown number. 3 rings with the even spacing of a line that was not going to disconnect. Calloway had told me at our last contact that Victor Hale had been through Charlotte twice in the past 10 days, still circling, still running whatever sequence he had calculated. I picked up the phone. I answered. The voice on the other end was calm in a way that requires practice to produce, not relaxed, not natural. Practiced, the specific register of a person who has rehearsed a tone they intend to project. "Mr. Weller," the voice said. "My name is Victor Hale. I think it's time we spoke with each other directly." I sat in the loading zone with the engine off and the city moving past the windshield. 30 seconds into that call, I understood something with complete clarity. He believed he was making the first move. He had no way of knowing that I had spent the previous 90 minutes in a conference room on the second floor of a building 2 blocks behind me, handing his name to a homicide detective who was already opening a file. He thought he had surprise on his side. He did not. I stayed in the car. I did not drive away. I held the phone and I listened, because listening carefully to someone like Victor Hale is how you learn exactly what he believes he can take from you. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed a tone the way other people rehearse arguments. Not the words, the register. Measured, unhurried. The voice of someone who believes the conversation is going exactly as planned, because it is the only version he has prepared for. He told me that Catherine had kept his son from him for 34 years. He said the word son, the way people say words they have been holding in their mouths for a long time, with the specific weight of something that has been compressed. He said he understood that this was a difficult situation for everyone involved. He said he had a legitimate grievance which he had tried to address through proper channels and had not been met in good faith. I said, "I see." He moved forward. He suggested that the situation did not need to become complicated. He said the word complicated the way lawyers say it when they mean expensive and public and damaging to everyone. He told me he was prepared to discuss a resolution that would allow the family, he said family, without pausing to move through this quietly in a way that protected Ethan's interests and Lucas's and the Weller name. He said the Weller name with the specific care of a man who has identified precisely where someone keeps something they cannot afford to lose. I understood what he was describing. He was not asking me to write a check. He was asking me to not obstruct. To recognize that Ethan's position as Catherine's sole heir, as the son of a man, Victor Hale now claimed, publicly created a natural structure for certain arrangements to proceed. He would not call it payment. He would call it a family resolution. I said, that's an interesting way to frame it. What exactly would the arrangement look like practically? He told me. Not all of it, he was too careful for that, but enough. The language he used was the language of estate management and trust administration and cooperative legal process. Underneath the language was a number he mentioned as an example of what appropriate recognition might represent. It was not a small number. I said, I'd need some time to think through the implications. This isn't something I can respond to without sitting with it. He said he understood completely. He gave me a number to call him back on, a different one than what had appeared on my screen. He said he looked forward to a productive conversation. He said my name at the end of the call, and then the line went quiet. I sat in the loading zone for 10 seconds. Then I called Harris. She answered on the second ring. I told her the call had come and approximately 12 minutes ago, that I had kept him talking for 7 of those minutes, and that he had provided a callback number before ending the call. She said, "The call was already in process when you rang. We have what we need from it." A pause. "You did exactly right, Mr. Weller. Don't initiate contact with that number. Don't respond if he calls again without reaching me first." I said I understood. "One more thing," she said. "Do not go home and discuss this with anyone in the household." I said there was nothing to discuss. I drove north on Tryon and then east toward Selwyn. The streets were quiet at that hour, the particular quiet of a city that has not yet emptied, but is in the process of doing so. I drove with both hands on the wheel and did not turn the radio on the way I had driven back from Lake Norman the week before. I thought about the number Victor had named. I thought about the phrasing family resolution, appropriate recognition, and the specific way he had placed Lucas into the conversation, not as a threat, but as a reminder that there were things in my life he had already mapped. My phone rang again. Not an unknown number this time. Ethan. I held the phone for one ring and then answered. Dad. His voice was different from its ordinary register. Not lower, something else, something I could not place immediately. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said. A pause on his end. Then, no. I wanted to hear your voice. Another pause. That's all. He ended the call before I could respond. I sat in the parked car outside the house on Selwyn for a while after the line went quiet. The engine was off. The street was still. I pressed the phone flat against my palm and held it there. I had spent 3 weeks thinking about what Ethan had done. The recordings, the photograph on Providence Road, the careful answering of questions about my retirement accounts and insurance structure, and the beneficiary designations I had not updated correctly after Catherine died. I had organized all of it into a file. I had presented it to a structural review board of 1 attorney and 1 homicide detective, and I had done it correctly. And the outcome of that effort was now in motion through processes I did not control. I had not spent 3 weeks thinking about what Ethan was feeling. I sat with that distinction for the first time. Just wanted to hear your voice. The voice I had heard a moment ago was not the voice of a man executing a plan with a managed associate. It was something else, a frequency I had heard from him before, at a different age, in a different decade. Something that had not resolved itself into an action. I did not know what had put him at that register tonight. Whatever it was not the same shape as what I had documented in the file. I drove home. The streets were quiet all the way. I replayed the call in the particular involuntary way you replay things you cannot yet classify, looping without deciding, examining without concluding. The tone of it. The 2-second pause before he said he just wanted to hear my voice. The fact that he had ended the call before I answered, which was not something Ethan did. I had heard that specific quality in his voice one other time. He had been 16 years old, standing at the back door on the landing after a day at school that he had not told us the details of. Not yet ready to come inside. Standing at something, not across from me at it. I did not know what had brought him to that place tonight. I found out before the night was over. I went to bed expecting not to sleep. I was right. I lay in the dark with the ceiling above me and did not think about Victor Hale. I had already thought about Victor Hale as much as the situation required. What I thought about in the specific quiet of the house after midnight was Ethan. Not Ethan in the recordings. Not Ethan in the photograph taken 3 days ago at the table on Providence Road. The other one, the one I had been keeping at the edge of the evidence file for 3 weeks. Not because he wasn't part of what I had documented, but because looking at him directly required something I had not allowed myself yet. I thought about a Saturday in May, 11 years ago. Ethan's graduation from NC State. There had been a weather system moving up from the coast, that morning rain from the Charleston area. The forecasters had said possibly significant. I had gotten up at 5:30 and driven east out of Charlotte anyway, because there was no version of that day on which I did not sit in the front row. The ceremony was held at the arena on Cates Avenue. It was a large class engineering college combined with 2 others, nearly 3,000 people on the floor, and another several thousand in the seats. The faculty processional went first, and then the students filed in, and the arena filled with the specific noise of an occasion that carries more weight than it knows how to contain. I sat in the second row from the floor and watched the lines of students file past. When Ethan came through, he was moving with the particular focused attention of someone who is simultaneously trying to locate a specific face in a crowd of several thousand, and also appear as though he is not doing this. He was scanning. Left side of the arena, then center, then right. I raised my hand once, not waving, just a flat, vertical gesture, and his eyes passed over it and continued past, and then came back. When he found me, his face did something complicated. Not a smile exactly. Something below a smile. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying a question, "Will you be here?" and has received the answer. He held my gaze for a moment, long enough to be a decision, not an accident, and then looked forward again as the line moved. I sat with that memory in the dark and tried to place it beside the audio recording. The voice that had answered Victor Hale's questions with patience and detail, accounting structure by accounting structure, beneficiary by beneficiary. I tried to make both of those into a single person. I could not. But I had lived 63 years, and I had worked in a field that requires you to understand how structures fail. And what I knew with certainty, what I would have told any person sitting across from me with a comparable problem, was that people are never entirely one thing. The structural failure is never simply the event that caused it. It is the accumulation of conditions over time that made that event possible. The question you ask about a collapsed structure is not only what broke it, it is what it was carrying alone for how long before the breaking point. Ethan had found out in 2021 that the man who had raised him might not be his biological father. He had gone to Catherine. He had agreed to carry it quietly. And 6 months later, Victor Hale had appeared. I thought about that timing. Victor had known what he was doing. A man in the specific crisis of not knowing who he is, not knowing which version of his own origin story is true, is not a man who is making his most defended decisions. Victor had not simply offered money. He had offered a narrative. You are my son. You were kept from what you were owed. The wrong is not yours, and the wrong can be corrected. The most effective manipulation is the kind that finds the true wound and positions itself as the answer to it. Victor Hale had understood exactly what Ethan was carrying. He had arrived with exactly the right shape of relief. I did not know what that understanding changed. I did not know yet whether it changed anything. I lay in the dark, and I did not try to resolve it, because resolution was not available to me at 2:30 in the morning, and forcing it would only produce something that looked like a conclusion without being one. The doorbell rang at 2:47. I heard it as a fact before I heard it as a sound, the mind reaching the information slightly ahead of the ears. I reached over and turned the bedside lamp on and sat up. The house was otherwise completely quiet. I went to the window at the end of the hall that looked down over the front step. I turned on the porch light. I looked down. Ethan was standing on the top step. He was wearing the same dark jacket he had worn in the photograph on Providence Road, but something about the way he was standing inside it was different, as though it fit differently than it had 3 days ago. He was holding his phone in both hands, pressed against his stomach, the way you hold something you have been looking at for a long time and have not yet put away. His face was turned up slightly toward the porch light. He looked in that moment like the man on the stage at the arena on Cates Avenue scanning for something, having found it waiting for the next part of the sequence to begin. He also looked like someone I had never seen before. Not a stranger. Something more unsettling than a stranger. A person who had been remade into someone they did not fully recognize yet, whose features were familiar but whose interior had been reorganized by something that had happened in the hours since I last heard his voice on the phone. I stood at the window and looked at my son standing in the porch light at 2:47 in the morning. And I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in the absence of everything else, that this night, whatever words were about to pass between us, whatever came next, or failed to, whatever was preserved and whatever was not. This night was the line. There was a before, there would be an after, and whatever we were to each other on the other side of this door would be determined in some significant part by what happened in the next hour. I went downstairs. I opened the door. Before I tell you what Ethan said when Thomas opened that door at 2:47 in the morning, drop "door" in the comments right now. This is the moment the entire story has been building toward. Stay with me. A note. This story contains some fictional elements crafted to serve the depth of the telling. Names and locations are coincidental, but what it asks of you is completely honest. He did not speak first. He held out the phone screen facing me, the call log pulled up and visible. Victor Hale. 11:04 p.m. Duration 8 minutes. I stepped back from the door. That was the gesture of invitation. Ethan stepped inside. We went to the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten pasta and soup and talked about Lucas's soccer formation and waterproofing quotes and every subject that had been available to us that was not the subject between us. He sat in his usual chair. I sat across from him. He put the phone face up on the table between us and did not touch it again. "I saw a document," he said. Diana had been working at the table after dinner. She left one page when she went upstairs. I don't know if she meant to. He paused. It had his name on it, not in the financial fraud section, in the person of interest column for a vehicular homicide investigation. I waited. I stood in the kitchen for 11 minutes. I counted because I needed to know how long it took me to decide. He looked at the phone on the table. Then I called him. What did he say? Ethan's hands moved to the edge of the table. Not gripping, just resting there the way you put your hands somewhere when standing becomes too much. I asked him directly. I said, "Did you have anything to do with what happened to Catherine Weller on I-85 in April?" He stopped. He didn't deny it. He said she had been going to destroy everything we had built, that he hadn't had another choice. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made the low sound it makes when the compressor cycles. Outside, nothing. "She was my mother," Ethan said. It was the first time since 2021 that I had heard him use that word for Catherine. Not her. Not she. My mother. "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment, checking something I thought. Then he continued. He told me everything in the sequence it had happened. Victor contacting him in January of 2022, 3 weeks after Ethan had confronted Catherine. The conversation at a coffee shop on Central Avenue, not Providence Road. That had been later. Victor's framing of the situation. Catherine had kept Ethan from his biological father for 34 years, had denied both of them a relationship they were owed, and the legal situation, as it stood, would allow that wrong to be corrected now if Ethan was willing to be part of the process. The correction, Victor had said, would benefit Ethan directly, substantially. Ethan described what he had provided: the account structures, the insurance information, the beneficiary designations, the portfolio values, each piece delivered across a sequence of calls and meetings that he had told himself were preliminary research context. Setting information that wasn't hurting anyone. He said all of this without modifying it. No qualifications, no arguments about what he had believed or hadn't believed at each point. He laid it out the way you lay out a structure you are responsible for and do not intend to obscure. I knew it was wrong, he said. Each time. I told myself it was just information, that nothing was actually being moved or changed, that I could stop before anything real happened. A pause. That is not what stopping looks like. I didn't stop. I sat with that for a while, a long while. The compressor cycled again. The porch light I had turned on when I heard the doorbell was still on, and I could see the amber edge of it across the kitchen floor. I didn't know about the accident. He said it straight without the inflection of a plea. I swear to you I had no knowledge of what he was planning to do. When it happened when she died, I thought it was an accident. I spent 8 months believing it was an accident. I know, I said. He looked at me again. This time he held it. I'm going to call her first thing in the morning, he said. Detective Harris, I have records of everything, copies of the messages, call logs, dates, the approximate figures he named in each conversation. I kept them. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe I always knew what they were. He flattened both palms on the table. I'll give her everything, all of it. We sat in the quiet for another minute. I know I have no standing to ask you for anything, he said. I'm not asking, I just... He stopped. Then, she was my mother. Whatever else is true. And you. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What came next was not a sentence. It was a word he had not used with me I now understood. Since the night in a hospital parking lot in March of 2020, since before he had found out that the thing he was calling me might not be the right thing to call me, since before he had spent 3 years trying to decide. What he said was, Dad, you were the only person I wanted to see tonight. I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle where it needed to settle in the specific place where things land when they have been a long time arriving. You should try to sleep, I said finally. Use the room at the end of the hall. He nodded. He picked up the phone from the table and held it. Then he set it back down and left it there and went upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table alone and called Margaret Collins. She answered on the second ring. She told me what to have ready for the morning. Victor Hale was arrested at 7 the following morning at a hotel on Moorhead Street. The arrest was made by 2 CMPD officers accompanying Detective Harris. He was found in his room and did not resist. By 8, Ethan was in the lobby of the department headquarters with a defense attorney presenting his cooperation formally and without condition. I was not in either of those rooms. I had been told not to be, and I understood why, and the instruction was not difficult to follow. I drove home from the station alone after. The house on Selwyn was quiet when I came in, quieter than it had been in many weeks, and a different quality of quiet than I had known in the months since Catherine died. Not the quiet of a structure under load it was not designed to carry. Something that had the particular quality of a room after the weight has been removed, and before anything else has been placed inside it. I did not know yet what to put there. I did not know what came next, for Ethan or for me or for the two of us together, and I was not going to know for a long time. A week passed. Then the doorbell rang. The week after Victor's arrest passed differently from the weeks before it. The way time passes when the thing you have been bracing to receive has finally arrived, and you are left standing in the quiet of what remains unsure of what to do with hands that have been holding something for so long. The legal process moved on its own schedule, as it always does. Ethan had entered a formal cooperation agreement 2 days after presenting himself at the department with his attorney. The charges against him were reduced significantly: 1 count of conspiracy, a suspended sentence, a period of supervised probation. He would not go to prison. Victor Hale was held without bond on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and wire fraud, awaiting a trial date. Diana was not charged. The district attorney's office issued no public statement about her involvement, and I did not expect them to. I remained in the house on Selwyn and did what there was to do. There is a particular discipline to the time after a sustained crisis, and I had not yet learned its shape. I managed most things correctly. I answered correspondence, returned phone calls from colleagues 8 at reasonable intervals. I ran in the mornings, which I had not done in months, and found that movement helped in the specific way that movement helps when thinking does not. What I could not do for several weeks was wash Catherine's coffee cup, the pale blue one from a potter's studio in Asheville, the one she had reordered when the first one chipped, the one that had sat in its exact position to the right of the sink for so many years that the countertop beneath it had taken on the ghost of a ring. I ran water around it each morning. I did not touch it. On a Sunday morning in May, I washed it. The window above the sink was open, and the light came in from the east, the way it does on clear spring mornings, direct and clean without commentary. I washed the cup and set it in the drying rack and stood at the sink for a moment. Then I made coffee in it and drank it at the table where Catherine had drunk hers, and I looked at the backyard through the window, and I let that be enough for that morning. My sister drove up from Raleigh one weekday without calling ahead. She came in through the back door, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not explain herself or ask anything. We drank coffee together, and she refilled both cups without making it an occasion. After about an hour, she said she had to get back on the road. She hugged me at the door and left. I had not understood until that morning that presence does not require language to carry its full weight. I drove to Lake Norman alone on a Wednesday in early June. The cabin looked the same, recently stained siding, clean gutters, the firewood still under its tarpaulin. The pansies in the ceramic pot on the top step were gone, finished with the season, but the pot was still there. I went to the porch and carried 2 cups of coffee out with me. I set one on the arm of the right Adirondack chair and sat down in the left one and looked out at the water. The lake held the morning sky without distortion. A heron stood at the far edge of the dock and worked the shallows with the infinite patience of an animal that understands precisely what it is looking for. I watched it for a while. Then I spoke to the empty chair beside me briefly without preparation. I said, "You built this well, Catherine. You always did." Then I finished my coffee and sat for a while longer in the particular quiet of a place that has been found and returned to, and I drove back to Charlotte. I called Ethan in the second week of June. He answered before the second ring. His voice was careful and tightly held, the way it had been in all our conversations since the kitchen table. "I'm not calling to talk about what happened," I said. "I'm calling because Lucas needs to know his grandfather is still here." There was a long silence, long enough that I could hear him breathing through something he did not yet have the right words for. "Dad," he said. "We'll need time," I said. "But time we have." The doorbell rang on a Saturday afternoon. I went to the door and opened it. Lucas was standing on the top step, holding a piece of paper folded carefully into quarters, the way children fold things when they have decided the contents are significant. Diana stood behind him with her hand resting on his shoulder, and she looked at me the way she had looked at me when she opened the cabin door months before, the expression of someone who has been holding something for a long time and can finally see who it belongs to. "And Grandpa T," Lucas said, "I made this for you." I crouched down to his height. He placed the folded paper in both my hands with the specific gravity of a child who has thought carefully about the act of giving. I opened it. A pencil drawing lines gone over more than once, the proportions considered and reconsidered. 3 figures standing in front of a house with a peaked roof and 2 windows. The smallest figure had a cluster of curls at the top. Beneath them, in careful block letters that had clearly been practiced elsewhere before being committed to this page, "Me, Mom, and Grandpa Thomas." I looked at it for a long time. "We can go," Diana said quietly. "If you need the space, we can come another." I stood up. I opened the door wider. "No," I said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." They came inside. Lucas spotted the chessboard on the coffee table before he had fully crossed the threshold. He stopped. "Oh," he said, with the particular arrested attention of a child who has just located exactly what he wants to do with the next hour. "Grandpa, can we play set up the pieces?" I said. "I'll be right back." I went to the kitchen. I set the kettle on and found the tin of hot chocolate powder in the cabinet above the coffee maker, in the same place Catherine had always kept it. I measured coffee into the press and stood at the window above the sink, while the water heated, looking out at the neighbor's roof and the line of the tree behind the fence, the same view. The same afternoon angle of light, the same geography I had looked at for 19 years on 10,000 ordinary days. Through the doorway into the living room, I could see Diana carefully arranging the chess pieces on the board, while Lucas corrected her placement of each knight with great authority. The light through the front windows had the particular quality of early June in the late afternoon, warm and unhurried, the kind of light that stays. The house was no longer holding its breath. I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the kettle and looked through the doorway, and I knew with the plain, undramatic clarity of knowing that does not announce itself that I understood where I was. Not where I was going, or what the next year would require, or how the shape of things between Ethan and me would form itself over time. Those were questions for other mornings. This one was sufficient. I made 3 cups that afternoon. One for me, one for Diana, and a small hot chocolate for Lucas, who beat me at the 3rd game and laughed exactly the way Catherine used to laugh, as though the whole room were needed to hold it. Outside, the spring light stayed longer than usual. I let it. There is something I have come to believe, and God has had a hand in teaching me this, that the people we most need find us exactly when we need them. Sometimes at 2:47 in the morning. Sometimes holding a piece of paper folded into quarters. This is a family story, and like most stories that truly matter, it began long before I knew it had started. My honest advice: do not be like me. Do not spend years building a life on a foundation you never stopped to examine. Ask the harder questions while there is still time, while there are still people across the table who can answer them. I believe this: the truth, however late it arrives, is always worth more than the silence that kept it away. And I believe that Grandpa's stories, the ones that cost something, the ones that leave a mark, are always a family story in disguise. In Grandpa's stories like this one, we tend to remember only the ending. We forget how long the road was. That road is the actual family story. That is what makes Grandpa's stories worth telling. If something here moved, you share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. And if you haven't subscribed, this is a good place to start, because more stories are coming, and I think you'll want to be here for them. To everyone who stayed until the very last word, thank you. It means more than you know. One final note: some of our upcoming stories contain fictional elements thoughtfully built for the purpose of reflection and understanding. If that is not for you, we completely respect that. Find the content that speaks to your season. But if you are staying, we are very glad you are here.